Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series on culturally relevant curriculum and culturally relevant schools. Tonight we have Hashim Jabbar, Executive Director of Racial Justice Now, and Dr. Molefi Kete Asante joining us. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Hashim, just so that folks know, right now all attendees are on mute, but if you have a question, you can type it into the chat box. You can also raise your hand, and once we get to Q&A, I can unmute you if you'd like to ask a question. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Hashim.
Thank you, Liz. This is Brother Jabbar with Racial Justice Now and the West Dayton Youth Task Force, and we are excited about our culturally relevant curriculum and culturally responsive schools webinar series with legendary and historical Dr. Molefi Kete Asante, theoretician of Afrocentricity. He is an author of over 80 books, a living legend in our time, and we are extremely honored and excited to have him with us here today. As many of you know, we have been on a campaign to promote culturally relevant curriculum and culturally responsive schools. We are now in our second year of this campaign. It has been going excellent, and we are very excited. That's Team Racial Justice Now. Shout out to our youth organizer, Josh, our parent organizer, Cameron Walker. Shout out to Mr. David Banner, who we met a few months back. Great rap artist, producer, and activist himself. And shout out to our co-founders, Queen Zakiya Sankara Jabbar, winner of many awards, the Drum Major of Justice Award. They're on the right with co-founder Professor Vernelia Randall, winner of the Change Champions Award just this past year in Washington, D.C., winner of the Community Advocate Award from the Nation of Islam the year previous. You can see co-founder Dr. Vernelia Randall in the beautiful green, black, and yellow outfit there in Iran, invited out to address the world on race in America. So we are standing on a strong foundation, and we are excited to tell you a little bit more about our campaign for culturally relevant curriculum and culturally responsive schools. Last year, we did a webinar series of 3 webinars. We were very informed and excited to learn so much from the great Lynn Morton from Kofi in Chicago. She's our fellow co-chair of the Dignity in Schools campaign. She had a brilliant presentation on culturally relevant curriculum, specifically in regards to culture and restorative justice. She is a professional in that area, and you can see that webinar up on the Dignities in Schools YouTube page. We also had Dr. Samari Kamara from the Kamali Academy, who is actually repatriated to Ghana. He's a brilliant scholar that is also up on the Dignity in Schools YouTube page. And the last webinar that we had last year was with retired teacher Baba Victor Gibson from Detroit Public Schools. He was a teacher for 30 plus years at Paul Robeson Malcolm X Academy in DC and Detroit Public Schools. And that was so very impressionable because he talked specifically to teachers, administrators, and schools and informed them of the things that they needed to know to implement culturally relevant curriculum. And he spoke from a professional classroom experience. Some of the policy recommendations that we've put forth to the Dayton Public School System through our campaign have been very successful. We proposed and recommended to the school board that they implement 2 books into the curriculum, The Miseducation of the Negro by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and also Up from Slavery by Mr. Booker T. Washington. These great scholars have put together, I hate to use the term Negro classics, but it only refers to the time period of which time these books were written. But these stand today on their own 2 feet as classics, and they are still brilliant information for young people to know and to learn. Some information about Dr. Carter G. Woodson. He's a adept of information, just as our guest speaker today, Dr. Molefi Kete Asante. Dr. Carter G. Woodson is the father of what we call Black History Month. He was a graduate of Harvard University and wrote many historical works, including the Miseducation of the Negro, and also started his own institute that we call ASALA today, the Association of the Life and History of African Americans. Dr. Booker T. Washington, or Mr. Booker T. Washington, was the educator and founder of the Tuskegee Normal Industrial Institute, what is known today as Tuskegee University. The brilliance of this man is that he has an institute that still stands today. The great works that he did are overlapping in generation, overlapping in culture, which Dr. Asante is going to talk to us a little bit about here in a few minutes. But we are still able to access the institution that he started in the late 1800s. So our policy recommendation was based on the demographic of our school district, which is 70% and more African American or Black. So to get into our webinar today, we have again a giant with us, Dr. Molefi Kete Asante. We're going to go through a few questions with him before we get into his newest book of over 80 plus books, Revolutionary Pedagogy, a primer for teachers of Black children. For those of you who are not familiar, Dr. Asante is the professor and the chair of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. His expertise in Afrocentricity, African civilizations, Africological theory and methods, and African American experiences. Dr. Asante is an activist intellectual who is president of the Molefi Kete Asante Institute for Afrocentric Studies and the professor and chair of the department at the studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. He also serves as the international organizer for Afrocentricity International. He's a guest professor at Zhangjiang University. How bad did I tear that name up? I'm not sure. Hangzhou, China, and professor extraordinarius at the University of South Africa. Dr. Asante has published over 83 books, and the most recent are Erasing Racism, The Survival of the American Nation, Revolutionary Pedagogy, The History of Africa, African Pyramids of Knowledge, Facing South to Africa, and As I Run Towards Africa. Dr. Asante has published more than 500 articles and is considered the most published African American scholar, as well as one of the most distinguished authors in African world. He's been recognized as one of the 10 most widely cited African scholars, and has also been recognized as one of the most influential leaders in education. So thank you, Dr. Asante, for being with us today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling very well, and I'm happy to be with you. I'm delighted. I appreciate you very much for inviting me to this webinar.
As I prepared today, Dr. Asante, for this webinar, I really felt today in my spirit that there was some work that was being done around restoring the African village. And so one thing that we do in our own culture and history is to respect and honor our ancestors. One thing that you shared with me was that you are the most published African American scholar, but there's another African who is known as the most published African. And if you could just share a little information, I think it was Mr. Falala.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think that when you consider that Toyin Falala, who is a professor at the University of Texas, but he's originally from Nigeria, is the most published African person that's living now. Maybe not, throughout history, but certainly at this present time. Falala is the author or editor of more than 100 books, and his students have also written many books. So at one time, people used to say that I was the most published scholar, but Falala has far exceeded me. And I'm very, very proud of him, because when I did my DNA testing, it came out that I was actually on my paternal side. My paternity goes back to Yoruba. So when I met him and we were introduced to each other, I said, so I see one Yoruba to another Yoruba. We're both eager to get our writings out. So yes, we have a wonderful relationship. He's a great man, a great scholar, and somebody who I respect quite a lot. So I'm chasing Toyin Falala in this regard. And he is certainly somebody to be highly respected. And I just want to also put a plug in while I'm saying this for two other people. James Conyers from the University of Houston, and Raylan Rabaka from the University of Colorado. These are two of my former students. And James Conyers himself has over 35 books. And Raylan Rabaka has written about 15 books. And these are two of my PhD students who are former PhD students who are doing very, very well and are following the same tradition. So you can look up Conyers or you can look up Rabaka and you'll be quite impressed.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And we will look them up. One thing we know is that you can't be a good teacher if you're not a good student. Absolutely. And clearly, by the work that you do and have done in your publishing, that you're a good student. Can you share with us a little bit about your motivation for writing over 80+ books?
Thank you very much. When I was a graduate student at the University of California, Los Angeles, I remember one night late, maybe around 1 a.m. in the morning, actually, because at that time, the research library at UCLA stayed open all night. And I was in there and I happened to be in the section where there were books about African people and Black people. And I went down the rows looking at all the books that had been written by Black people. And the majority of those books were written by white people. And when I opened books, many of the books had been written by people who had either been to Africa or had lived there as missionaries or had imagined that they had been to Africa. And these books, many were negative. The majority of them were negative, had negative expressions about African people, spoke of Africans as primitives and savages, much like President Trump's idea about African people. So it was quite strange to me. And I said to myself that we are the only people who have not taken charge of our own history. Everybody else writes their own history. Jewish people write their own history. If you go to the Jewish section, you see that most of the books that are written by Jewish people. If you go to the English section, most of the books about English people written by English people, you see. But with African people and with African Americans at that time, it seemed to me that most of the books that were written about us were written by Europeans. And the negativity that was expressed became a part of the American fabric. And so I vowed to do as much as I could to change that. And that it was my ambition as a young person, if I'm going to be a writer or a scholar, I'm going to learn the methods and the techniques of writing and publishing and being engaged in debate and discussion. And that was my focus, my objective. You can't do everything, but it was one thing that I loved, I could do well. And so I began to write. But you're right, you have to read and you have to study in order to be able to write, because you got to have something to write about. So I read everything. I read everything. I read everybody. I'm aware of what is going on in the world. And I am very much engaged in reading about Asian theories. I'm particularly interested in Yoshitaka Miike's work on Asiocentricity. I engage with people who write about physics. So you have to write and out of knowledge. You can't write out of nothing. You got to have something to base it on. And so
Right.
I'm engaged in that process.
In African history, there is lessons regarding the burning down of our libraries, and also stories of families that kept books for preservation from these libraries being burned down. And your large collection of personally written books remind me of those stories. Could you briefly share a little bit of that history with me today and its relevance to modern day and time?
Well, yes. I mean, people have always assaulted knowledge, and particularly knowledge that was challenging to the status quo. And in fact, if you look at throughout African history, you have had this attack on African knowledge. You're very, very right, and African information. I mean, many people, of course, refer always to the destruction of the library at Alexandria, but there was a destruction not just at Alexandria, there was destruction at Waset. Waset was more important than Alexandria in many respects because it was the first university, was at Waset. And this was a city that the Greeks named Thebes, and that the Arabs, when they conquered, named Luxor. But this was the center of African power and African knowledge. It was, of course, utterly destroyed. But not only there, but throughout the continent itself, when there were places in Ethiopia, places even in the Congo where you had knowledge and people had kept certain valuable artifacts of their culture. These things were destroyed, they were burned. I mean, the invasions, both by Islamic people, particularly the Arabs coming out of Arabia and into Africa, and by the Europeans, the Christian missionaries. Both of these invasions destroyed lots of African history and culture. The other thing I remember as a student at UCLA was being very interested in art. And one of the keepers of the African art section at UCLA took me to the library and I'm sorry, not to the library, but to the basement of a building that was called Haynes Hall. If you've been on the campus, you know Haynes Hall. And he showed me 2,000 pieces of Yoruba cultural art. And I remember being amazed, like, how did that get to America? Right. 2,000 pieces of Yoruba art. Right. And then, of course, the story, and this Yoruba art also told history. There was narrative. People didn't understand that the artistic forms were also narrative forms in terms of the ideological and philosophical perspective of African people. And then they would turn around and say, well, you know, Africans don't have any culture. Right. So yeah, wow, you got it all. You brought it, you took it all, you stole it all, or you burned it, you know, destroyed it, and so forth. So this is so my motivation comes out of that. My intense desire to see that the destruction of African information and knowledge be reconstituted, and that we reconstruct things on the basis of Afrocentric understandings, because that's essential.
Thank you for that. And that leads me right into our next question. We have our culturally relevant curriculum toolkit, which is up at dignityinschools.org/CRCTK. And we reference one of your articles that you wrote, one of your numerous articles that you wrote. And in the article, you talk about your dilemma at the time of seeing African students knowing many languages in comparison to African American students that could barely deal with English, among other differences. And can you share with us, which was my greatest takeaway from our first year campaign to promote culturally relevant curriculum and culturally responsive schools, which was being centered, your theory of being centered into your culture and history. And there's also the opposite side of that, which is being decentered. We work against the school to prison pipeline, and we know oftentimes that African American students are oftentimes labeled as poor students with reluctance to want to learn. But what we are finding is that there's a disinterest in curriculum and school by Black students. So again, can you share what you mean by being centered and or decentered, and then share a little bit about the differences between African and African American students?
Thank you very much for that question, because Brother Jabbar, that is really the key to any discussion of culturally relevant curriculum and opening up this whole idea of how we really regain our children. Let me start this way with that question. The highest level of education in the United States, highest level of education in the United States of America today is attained by immigrants from Africa. That is not from Asia, not from China, not from Japan, not from Korea. The highest levels of education, at the highest levels, the ethnic communities, the communities that have the highest level of education in their population are immigrants from Africa. Now, that tells you one thing, right? And not only in the United States, it's also true in Britain. The second thing I want to say is this, that I've traveled throughout the continent of Africa many times. I take groups to Africa. I've taken many groups. I'm taking a group to Egypt again this year in July. So I've lived in Africa, I lived in Zimbabwe. Here's what you learn. You learn that people not only master many languages, but they are able to gain access even to English and French and German. These are European languages quite easily, even to Chinese. I know some Senegalese who speak Chinese, right? Mm-hmm. And I met one brother who speaks 17 languages.
Wow.
So when you come to America and you ask yourself, what is it with the African American? And I'm African American. I'm born in Georgia. Grew up in the cotton fields and tobacco fields of South Georgia. So you ask yourself, what is the problem? And the answer to that is very simple. That African children in America, African American children, are basically just like Carter G. Woodson, whom you described so beautifully. Just like Carter G. Woodson said, we have basically been educated away from ourselves. In other words, we have been decentered. Mm-hmm. So we don't look even at our own knowledge necessarily as useful. So if a person, for example, is speaking Xhosa in South Africa, Zulu becomes quite easy for that person to take or to learn, or Sotho, because they assume that all of this is important information. But we sometimes even try, let me just say it this way. I grew up speaking Ebonics. One of the greatest problems I have had is, and I still believe is one of the deepest losses that I've ever had, was that I lost the ability to speak fluently my own native language, which was Ebonics. My mother never spoke English. She never tried to speak English. She never went to school to speak English. My father never went to school to speak English. What they spoke, we all understood. They spoke our language. Mm-hmm. And they used constructions and words that were directly from the African continent. Mm. But we've lost a lot of that. So I always say there's nothing wrong with being bilingual. You can be trilingual. You can be 17 languages. You can learn as many languages. So why give up Ebonics, which is the most beautiful language I have ever heard? And when I go to South Georgia and I hear it, I mean, someone says, you know, if you had asked me before, I might have could, but I'm tore up now. That's a whole different kind of construction of language that's different, totally different from you trying to speak English.
Yeah.
You know, and when a person says I'm fixing to go, they don't mean I'm getting ready to go. They mean I'm already going. So you have to understand the nuances of language and what
Right.
people have intended. So I think that's next to our music. Our greatest genius in this country was the creation of language. That language that we all could understand. That was a beautiful thing. And African people in America, African Americans should never give that up. So back to this centeredness, because that's what you asked me. Here's the deal. When you go to school, when you learn, the first thing, when you're in school, the first thing you should learn is about yourself. That is the first thing. You know who you are, who's your community, who your grandparents are, who your guardians are, who are the people who protect you. Where did you learn this from? That your first knowledge ought to be knowledge of self and your community. And that's why some schools now start with their curriculum with knowledge of community and so forth. But they don't mean the same thing we mean. When I said as a community, as an Afrocentrist, I'm saying that a little Black child should learn about Africa and his or her Africanness. That is fundamental, because if you don't start them where they're learning that, by the time they get to the third grade, we are losing them. That's the danger. So this notion of centering them allows them to have the kind of protection that is necessary, so that by the time they get to the third grade, they have immunity. And not only the immunity that will protect them, but they are now able to learn anything else. You can teach them anything after you have given them knowledge of self, which is to center them in their own history and in their own culture. That's the important thing.
Thank you. Thank you. That leads me right into our next question. In ancient African or Aboriginal traditions, there is a custom of knowing your family genealogy back 7 generations or more. Feel free to correct me if I go astray from the truth. But can you share a little bit about some of that custom and the importance of it?
Well, in some, that's a very good question, but in some cultures, it's even longer than 7 generations. It's at least 7 generations. I mean, I have been in conversations with people who can recite 35 generations of their history. So when you talk to them, you're amazed that in this village or that family, they can go back to 35 generations. This is a part of the cultural knowledge that we lost when they brought us here against our will to the American continents, North and South America. Some people forget that that South America has more Africans than North America. And but when they brought us over here to these continents and to the Caribbean, basically we were taken off of our cultural and geographical and historical terms, but we had, and so we held little things. We held some things. We remembered some things, but many things we forgot. And we have perhaps forgotten thousands of songs, thousands of symbols, and different stories, and all these things that we as a people have. But of course, we've gained others because we're very creative people.
Right.
There's no, I don't imagine. I mean, when I talk, I speak of the nobility of the African American because we basically have been very courageous and have made it possible to extend the boundaries of democracy and of freedom and of justice for other people in this society. When you talk to an African American, you have to realize that you're talking to courageous people, and despite sometimes the hardships that we see and the negativity that we see, we also have great nobility, and that's the thing that I think has distinguished us. But no, we have we come from a tradition where the elders are important, and that's why generations are important, because not only are elders important because they're close to the ancestors, but the ancestors are important. You know who you are because you know to whom you belong. If you don't know to whom you belong, then you really don't know who you are. And sometimes people get confused. I've been in meetings where people have said, okay, let's do libations to the ancestors. And then people would name European, Black people would name European, because they don't understand the concept that you know, who do you belong? What is your tradition? They don't realize their tradition. They don't know the sense of ancestors. Now, what's the importance of that? The importance of that is that all people, including European people in America, retain a sense of ancestral reverence. They don't tell you that. They wouldn't say that. But in every city, I live in a city like Philadelphia, which is filled with statues to white ancestors. It is a city filled with white ancestors, just like Richmond or Washington, D.C. or Boston. You go to these cities, just so many examples of the white ancestors. They have streets named after the ancestors. They have airports named after the ancestors. The whole thing is ancestral reverence. But when it comes to Africa, they say, no, you can't have a part of that. You shouldn't be doing that because, in fact, if you're doing that, that means you're worshiping your ancestors. You know, Europe always worships its ancestors. But this is the key, is that for you and for me, it becomes something that's negative. So I think that culturally relevant curriculum has to be curriculum that allows children to be centered in their own narrative of history. Because if they are not, then they are dislocated and they're displaced, and then they are more like renters of information. They're just renting information rather than being owners of information. If you're owner of information, that means you make history. You create history. You are not a spectator. I'm not a spectator to Europe. I'm an agent. I have an agency. I make things. I create things. I'm an author. I do things. I'm not just on the periphery of Europe. And yet I understand the impact of Europe on us, you see? So, but if you live in a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial society like the United States of America, all African people are asking for is to be to have our own rightful share of this. And that's the significant piece here, is not to say that we have to disrupt everything, but we can't just say that Europe can have all the food on the table. That's not correct. And we got to share. We got to share with Native Americans, the Latino American. We have to share with the Asian American. Everybody has to share, and everybody has to give and contribute. And we're saying that our contribution has to be respected and appreciated, and what we share with everybody else comes out of our own history and culture. If I don't have my own history and culture, I can't share. I just simply imitate. I just simply regurgitate what is Europe. And I remember a young sister, about 15 years of age, telling me that she went to a Girl Scout meeting, and they were all sitting around the fire, and they were telling where they were from and their history and culture and what they contributed to America. And when they went around the room, the young girl, Black girl, said that when they got to me, I couldn't say anything because everybody else had said everything I could think of. because everybody else had come out of their own culture. So
Right.
all she could think of was what the white girls had said. But the white girls, that's their culture. So she didn't know. She didn't know. She couldn't even. She said, I couldn't remember what we had achieved. What had we done? I couldn't. She didn't know about the pyramids. She couldn't even remember the spirituals. She couldn't even talk about the Harlem Renaissance poets. She didn't know any. She said, I didn't know anything. I was so embarrassed. I started crying.
That's meaningful, Dr. Asante.
Oh, that's a shame. Yes.
We have a typed in question right on that line, and it says, if I would recommend to a parent to search their genealogy, where would you suggest that they start?
Well, I think the best way to start is with AfricanAncestry.com. And the reason I start with AfricanAncestry.com, I know they got 23andMe and and Ancestry.com and all. They're useful as well. However, AfricanAncestry.com is the oldest and the longest organization that's been engaged in collecting data on Africans. So the important thing about AfricanAncestry.com is that they have more selections, or rather more collections of African DNA examples and samples than any other of those other groups. That is the thing. I mean, you know, if you want to find your African ancestry, then the key to that is to have as many samples that you can test it against. And AfricanAncestry.com does that.
Thank you for that, Dr. Asante. As we continue to move on, as time is not in favor of us, giving us all these jewels to go back on. Unfortunately, we'll be able to share this up on YouTube for viewers later on. But your theory of Afrocentricity, of for Black children or African American children or children of African descent to have Africa as their center from which they view the world. Now, this theory of Afrocentricity is not a new one, and neither is culturally relevant curriculum, although sometimes it seems as though we have to remake it that way. There has been a push against Afrocentricity. It has essentially been pushed out of schools. And can you provide an assessment of that?
Oh, yes, I can. I mean, first of all, Afrocentricity has been attacked only because it is from Africans. It's from Black people. And Black people have been attacked. I mean, it reminds me of something that James Baldwin, whom I knew, once said about African people, that it is not our hair that people dislike. You know, people go out and say, well, you know, maybe if Black people had straight hair, then this would be, but they said, no, it's not the hair they dislike. He says it's not even the language that we use that they dislike. They dislike us. So when it comes to Afrocentricity, so yeah, so you have Black people and white people, but a lot of Black people, maybe 25 school districts. And we had an opportunity to transform and revolutionize education in this country about 20 years ago. And then what happened, of course, because we also pushed for social justice and equal rights, we got Black administrators. And in most of the school districts where you have Black administrators who should have understood Afrocentricity, or culturally relevant curriculum, if that's what they want to call it sometimes, and that's what your organization is. If they wanted, if you had Black people who were superintendents, who were principals, and they understood it, it would be fantastic. But you got what we did. We got the equal rights agenda, so that we got Black people in positions. But I've run into many Black superintendents. I mean, I ran into the superintendent at Pittsburgh, for example, who was Black. But I always say that he's Black, but he doesn't understand African American history or culture, and he certainly doesn't understand education of Black children. So you get that kind of situation. You get people who have small minds, number one, and who simply want to imitate Europe without understanding that the decadence that we see even in our political situation is because of the education that they have given to European children in the society. I mean, how can you go to college and you come out and you still have the opinions about other people that say President of the United States Trump has? You can't do that. I mean, you're not educated. You're ignorant. There's no education here. There's no transformation. No person can go into school as a racist in kindergarten, and after 12 years they come out and they're still a racist. They haven't been educated. Mm-hmm. So I think that Afrocentricity, of course, is going to be victorious because it is already victorious in many African societies. It's already all over the continent of Africa. It is the dominant paradigm in South Africa among people who are educated and people who think about this. So it will ultimately be the dominant paradigm in Africa, because what Afrocentricity did was, for the first time, give African people throughout the world an intellectual idea that was based fundamentally on the narratives of African history. This has never happened before. We had many different ideas. We became everything else. We took on the Arab culture. We took on the European culture. We took on Buddhism. We became everything because we had no expression, no systematized paradigm out of our own historical realities that we could put forth on the world and say, let's share. So with Afrocentricity, what do we get? We get an idea that says that African people are subjects of our own history. We are in the center of making and creating and determining for ourselves the shape of our own world. And we don't impose that on other people. We just say that as an African person, at least, I have a say in this. I'm not on the side. I'm not a marginal person. So if you're talking mathematics, then at least talk to me about the African mathematicians, men and women. Tell me about Hypatia. The first woman mathematician who was an African, on an African continent. Don't start talking to me about philosophy from Europe, from Greece, when the first philosophers were from the Nile Valley civilization. Talk to me about Imhotep or Ptahhotep or Dwarf, or talk to me about Amenemhat, or Merikari, or Amenhotep, the son of Hapu. These are the philosophers that I know who lived before Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. Socrates, Aristotle, Plato. So that's the very beginning. Our people, because of colonization of the African continent and the enslavement of African people, our people have been disrupted for 500 years, taken away from our own knowledge and set down in a place where we were searching around for something to hold on to. And we discovered that the thing that we had to hold on to were the images and the ideas that came from our slave masters, whether they were Arabs or whether they were Europeans.
Well, we thank you for Afrocentricity that we can hold on today, Dr. Asante, and we are so excited to learn about this theory and how we can implement it. So what exactly would you tell parents about pushing for culturally relevant curriculum in schools?
I would tell parents that it is essential. It is your first argument, your first debate. And first of all, African-American parents have to go to the schools. You have to be in those schools. You got to sit in there. And if you are sitting in the classroom and you hear references that are negative about African people, you have to challenge it. It has to be questioned. You have to be engaged in the process. And let me just tell you this. most of our children, 95% of our children are educated by white people. Yes. And not only are they educated by white people, but by white women. And because of this, we have turned over many times our lives of our children into the hands of people who don't even love our children. And you cannot teach Black children unless you love them. Because what happens is that they recognize this person don't care for me and I don't care for them. So you create already a bad situation in the classroom. So what I tried to do, and I'm sure what y'all try to do at Dayton, is I go to school districts and I teach white teachers how to teach Black children. And to teach a Black child is to teach a child just like you would teach your own child. How would you teach your own child? You tell them about themselves. You basically start with what they know, and if they don't, and sometimes Black children don't know who they are. See, so if you're a white teacher and you have to teach Black children, and these Black children don't know, and the Black children parents don't know because they were taught by the same school. They don't know. Somebody says, "Well, the parents ought to teach that at home." Parents don't know that. Well, what parent could teach? I mean, their children the history, the literary history of African Americans. You mean how many parents would be able to sit their child down and tell them about Zora Neale Hurston, or Langston Hughes, or Paul Laurence Dunbar, or Phyllis Wheatley? Some would, but most would not. And if you go back to the African continent and tell who were the great generals of history, military geniuses, and you say Thutmose III. Most parents don't know that. So that's why it's important for people who are Afrocentric to teach teachers. Teachers go to school, they learn how to prepare their lesson plans, they have good intentions when they go to school. They go to these schools and then they meet our children and then they wonder why what they are teaching to the white children don't work with our children. And it doesn't work because our children need something more and something deeper. And our children can learn anything. I remember Dr. Freya Rivers in Michigan. She started teaching young African American children the ancient Egyptian language, as well as the Japanese, when they were in the 3rd and 4th grades. And children learned it. But the school system, the curriculum is designed in such a way in our societies that nobody, I mean, in Dayton, I'm pretty sure in Dayton, they don't teach ancient Kemetic language, Nile Valley language in the elementary school. But what's wrong with doing that? Nothing is wrong. That's an African language. It's classical African language. What's wrong with teaching African-American children Chinese? Since Chinese is going to be one of the biggest languages in the world. It already is and will be even greater. So you can start early. You don't have to wait till they get to 11th grade or something, or 9th grade. You can start early. But the scopes and sequences that they have in the curriculum is designed for white children. It's not designed for Black children.
And so on that topic, we have teachers on the line that you're talking to now. And this question always comes up when we talk about Afrocentricity and putting it into the public school system. One of the answers, which I can preview, is already that to bring you to the public school system and allow you to teach the teachers. Absolutely. But the question is, white teachers who would like to use culturally relevant curriculum feel at a loss because they are white. What do you suggest white teachers can do to relate to our children in their classrooms?
That's a very good question, and it's a very easy answer because, and let me just tell you this: many white teachers are doing a good job of teaching our children, and many black teachers are doing poor jobs of teaching our children because they have a white mentality. They have a Eurocentric mentality about the educational process of our children. And white teachers who are trained and educated and learn the information, and we've done this for 9 years up in Union County, New Jersey, where I've taught the teachers every year for 5 sessions. We go to build a critical mass of teachers in the school. We talk to the teachers about African American history, but not about African American history alone. What must you do to pull African American children into the subject? Say your subject, for example, is biology, all right? And you're teaching biology, and you're teaching it, as if you would be teaching it to any school. There's nothing wrong with you infusing that biology class with information about African American biologists. There's nothing wrong, for example, with you saying that Ernest Just was the first cell biologist in America. You don't even have to do a whole lesson on Ernest Just, but it may be good if if you got majority of Black kids in some of these classrooms in urban areas. Why not have somebody do a report on one of the great biologists of this country, Ernest Just? Talk about Ernest Just. Have him, and then you can go in and talk about all the biological principles you want, and you have already now captured the Black student. The Black child is in with you now because you have recognized that Black people have been biologists, and they have been great biologists. They've been some of the best. That's the way you so you capture this whole idea of capturing the attention of the student so that the student does not sit in the classroom. They're in the classroom, but they're outside of the subject. You want to bring them into the subject. What's the subject? If the subject is literature or if it's poetry, you want to bring them into it. But you also want to recognize contemporary African American poets. We got poets too. I mean, we got great, many of our rap artists are brilliant poets. They would have been considered been greater than Homer, that kind of thing. They would have been the people like Imhotep of the Harka. They've been great poets, you see. So you've got to be able to figure out how to utilize the knowledge, the information, and white teachers can do this just as well as Black teachers. But I think that one of the things they'll do is read my book, Revolutionary Pedagogy. That's first. And then I think books like George Day, DEI, he wrote a book called Teaching Africa. I think that's important. I think the book by Joyce King, the great Joyce King, and Ellen Swartz, and that book they wrote, which is called The Afrocentric Praxis of Teaching. I mean, these are some of the key books on just sort of orienting yourself. Because one of the things that I've discovered in teaching teachers is that you can teach teachers a lot of information, but part of what teachers need, they need basic ideas about how to insert the information into the lesson plans. And sometimes they need the curriculum itself needs to be changed, totally changed, particularly when it's a Eurocentric curriculum. For example, where you have someone saying, well, we're studying slavery, and we call it enslavement.
Exactly. Thank you.
Because it was some done to us. And there were no African slaves ever left Africa. Nobody went to Africa and picked up African slaves. They went to Africa and picked up African people and then enslaved those people, made those people. So we were in Africa, we were artisans, so we were farmers, we were fisher people, we were doing fishing, we were sewing, we were doing all our business, right? And they come and get us and bring us over here and enslave us. So it's no African slaves. It's only African people, African farmers and workers and teachers and priests and priestesses. And these were the people that were captured and brought into America and enslaved. So we need to teach that kind of thinking, that you have to be critical thinking. Don't build, don't go like one teacher down in Florida I was working with. She built in her classroom rendezvous structure to show how Africans live, and then said to me, Dr. Asante, I can't get the kids in this 5th grade class, Black kids, to even go inside the hut. I said, well, you shouldn't build a hut in the first place. It's not a hut. You can't call it a hut. Hut is a negative word. Why would a black child want to live in a hut? What do I want to talk about hut? I say, first of all, find out what do the people call these roundable, these round houses that you're talking about. Use their language. If you're in Zimbabwe, you use the Shona language. You call them an imba. You show these imbas, but imbas are not. The imbas don't represent a house. They just represent one room in a house. So you got to have 5 or 6 of those things built because you got to have maybe 2 or 3 of them for sleeping, and you got to have another one for guests. You got to have another one for storage of food and grain. And you have, I mean, and then the kitchen is outside. You know, people, they didn't have inside kitchen in the village. I'm talking villages now. So you can't, so the whole thing is a compound. If you talk about somebody's house in Africa, in the village, you have to talk about 3 or 4 of those roundable structures, or 5 of them or something, you see? And of course, in more modern cities like Lagos in Nigeria, which is the largest city in the world with 28 million people. That's why I was so upset with President Trump. I mean, he didn't know anything about Nigeria. 28 million people live in Lagos. That's 3 times the size of New York City. Wow. And people, if you don't know that, you won't have no sense of Africa. You ask stupid questions. Do they drive cars? Do they work? Are the people hustling? Come on. Can't ask stupid questions. You know what I'm saying? But you do that if you're educated in a system that does nothing to educate you.
And so back to that system, you already told us how you have worked with, was it Union City, New Jersey, or Union County, New Jersey, to implement curriculum there. Can you give us information briefly as we try to get a few more questions in before we're done? Some information on how teachers and parents can address superintendents and school leaders about curriculum changes as such.
Well, let me just say, in Union City, New Jersey, it was very simple. There was a sister, her Smith, we call her McKinney, Sister McKinney, and her husband went to the mayor of the city, demanded that a system where you have the majority of black children would have a culturally relevant curriculum, and because he was politically aligned with them, they went to the superintendent, and they told the superintendent, and then they brought me down to talk to the Board of Education. I spoke to the board people, and finally it happened. And how did it happen? By 2 community people. In Philadelphia, we had a situation where we wanted to have a African-American history class taught not as an elective, but as a requirement for all of the students who graduate from Philadelphia schools.
Yes.
And we had a committee of 3 or 4 people who put pressure on the superintendent, who went to the board, and they hired me to come in and write that course, and it's a required course in Philadelphia. You got to have, so you got to have community pressure, unfortunately. It ought to be something that the board would create itself, but almost in no place where I've been. We did Kansas City for a year. In Kansas City, it was the community who put pressure on the administrators and the superintendent. And in that system, also we ran into a black superintendent who was not supportive. So you have black superintendents in some of these schools who are not supportive, and the reason they're not supportive is because they have pressure from the white community. Sometimes the white business community. Sometimes they have pressure also from the state requirements. They're trying to figure out how to raise the scores. And I always tell them that you raise the scores by getting children interested in learning. If you don't get kids interested in learning, you can't just raise the score. Well, we only want to do nothing but just concentrate on raising the scores. Well, then you'll need culturally relevant education.
Thank you for that, Dr. Asante. That's so right. and so significant. One thing additionally, you have to know the political system as well and how to navigate that.
Absolutely. And I thank you very much for that. And you know what? I'm unfortunately I got to run to another meeting, but I really appreciate this webinar. This has been extraordinary.
And so I have 2 more questions, and if I can email those to you, you can get those back. We appreciate you for having us, and we look forward to further dialogue with you.
I thank you so much. You guys doing a great job. Peace.
And we look forward to dialogue with you soon. Peace.
All right.
And so at this time, Liz, if you could possibly read off those other questions. We thank everybody for tuning in. Please get to our culturally relevant curriculum online toolkit. It's on the DignityInSchools.org /CRCTK. You can view there the other webinars that we have. We have other sections covering just what he talked about, key terms, how to guide for advocates, how advocates can utilize this information to access the public school system, how to address your different committees, how to address your superintendents, your school boards, and more. We talk about the scholarly articles from Dr. Asante, Gloria Ladson Billings, and others. We talk about key terms. There's a wealth of information there for you to access. So at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Liz. And thank you so much for attending, and look for this information to be put up on the YouTube page soon and very soon at Dignity in Schools campaign.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining tonight's webinar. We did get a few more questions in that came in through the chat box. I'm sorry that we ran out of time, but we'll make sure to share those questions with Dr. Asante, and he can share answers. There was a question that came in asking about information for the YouTube website that was shared. So I'm going to send that out now through the chat box, but it's just youtube.com/DignityInSchools, and that has the past webinar recordings, and we should have today's webinar up tonight or tomorrow morning at the latest. Some other questions that came in were about information on Dr. Asante's training through his institute. So we'll make sure to follow up with him about that. There were more questions about sort of how to interact with superintendents and to try to get buy-in and implementation of culturally relevant curriculum, as well as other questions about the importance of teaching at historically black colleges and universities. So as I said, we'll make sure to get the additional questions that we missed to our presenters to share the answers with you. And we have all your emails from your registration, so we can make sure to send that. Hashim, is there any final words that you want to share before we end?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yep. So just that screen up there, that's an example of what is not culturally relevant curriculum in a majority non-white school. Let that page sink in there. But again, you can access all of this information on the Dignity in Schools campaign.org. Excuse me, that's DignityInSchools.org /CRCTK. And we are continually updating that online toolkit. You can also find information about racial justice now and the West Dayton Youth Task Force on rjnohio.org. And you can see, again, our webinars from the past on the Dignity in Schools YouTube page. So again, thank you everybody for tuning in. Continue to follow. Feel free to email me at hajabar@rjnohio.org. That's hajabar@rjnohio.org. And if you would like a copy of this PowerPoint, it can be emailed to you. And I will only send that if you email me directly at hajabar@rjohio.org. Thank everybody for attending and look forward to dialoguing with you more on this great, important subject of culturally relevant curriculum and culturally responsive schools.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.